You try to be patient. You explain yourself. You stay flexible, easygoing, understanding. And somehow, the more you do that, the more she interrupts you, pushes your limits, dismisses your needs, and treats your time like it doesn't matter. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you noticed that the more flexible you are, the less seriously she takes you? This isn't because women are cruel, and it's not because you're saying the wrong words or failing to communicate nicely enough. What's really happening is far more dangerous. You've been teaching her, quietly, repeatedly, how to treat you. Every time you let something slide. Every time you negotiate from weakness. And today, I'm going to break that pattern. Because there are 5 rules that determine whether a woman respects you or slowly walks all over you. Here's what most men get wrong. Boundaries are not about what you say. They're signals of position, of self-respect, of internal authority. Women don't respond to explanations. They respond to the frame you hold when pressure shows up. This video isn't about controlling her behavior. It's about stopping yourself from losing power without realizing it. If this hits a nerve, make sure you're subscribed and tap like, because this channel exists to help men recognize where respect is leaking and how to reclaim it before it's gone. There's a hard truth most men don't want to face, and it's this. Women don't accidentally walk over men. It doesn't happen out of nowhere. It doesn't happen because she suddenly changed. It happens because the signal was there long before the behavior showed up. When your boundaries are weak, you don't look kind. You look flexible under pressure. And flexibility, when it's unstructured, reads as permission. Think about how it actually unfolds. You notice something small that bothers you. You tell yourself it's not worth bringing up. You stay quiet to keep the peace. She pushes a little further next time. You feel irritation, maybe even resentment, but you swallow it again. And before you realize it, what once felt unacceptable has quietly become the new normal. This is how respect disappears, not through explosions, not through dramatic betrayals, but through silence, through hesitation, through the moments you tell yourself, I'll let this one slide. Respect doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes quietly. And the most dangerous part is that from her perspective, nothing improper is happening. She's responding to the frame in front of her, to the version of you that adapts instead of anchors, to the man who negotiates with his own discomfort before he ever opens his mouth. This isn't about blame, and it's not about villainizing women. This is about understanding a dynamic most men were never taught to see. Boundaries are not lines you draw once. They're positions you hold consistently. Before you ever say another word to her, before you try to explain how you feel or what you need, there's a more important question you have to answer honestly. Where do you stand with yourself? Because if you don't know your position, she never will. And until you do, every conversation you have will start from a place of weakness, no matter how calm, polite, or reasonable you sound. Rule number 1. Stop negotiating from confusion. The fastest way to lose power in a relationship is to negotiate from confusion. When you don't know exactly what you want, every boundary you try to set comes out shaky. You hesitate. You soften your tone. You leave room for exceptions you haven't even thought through yet. And without realizing it, you turn something that should be solid into something negotiable. Look closely at the pattern. When a man isn't clear with himself, he starts speaking in half statements. I guess. Maybe. It's not a big deal, but... He changes his mind mid-sentence. He backtracks when he senses resistance. He gives ground not because it feels right, but because he's afraid tension will cost him the relationship. Women read this immediately, not as kindness, but as a lack of inner structure. From her perspective, it feels like there's no firm ground to stand on, no center, no sense that you're anchored in your own standards. And when that happens, respect doesn't grow. It wobbles. This is why clarity matters so much more than communication skills. Clarity is not about saying things better. It's about deciding things earlier. A clear boundary is not created in the conversation. It's created before the conversation ever happens. It's the decision you've already made about your time, your space, your money, your priorities, without needing her agreement to validate it. Think about common areas where men get stuck. Personal time after work, access to your phone, financial decisions, family involvement. When you haven't defined these for yourself, you start negotiating emotionally in real time. And emotional negotiation always weakens your position. Here's the shift most men miss. Clarity is not rigidity, it's authority. When you know where you stand, you don't need to argue. You don't need to over-explain. You don't need to persuade. You simply state what is. That's why boundaries are not tools to manage her feelings. They're standards you live by. They're not requests for permission. They're expressions of self-respect. And the moment a woman senses that you've already made peace with your own decisions, that you're not trying to bargain your way into comfort, something changes. Your words carry weight. Your presence feels grounded. Until you get clear with yourself, every boundary will feel like a negotiation. And negotiations, when driven by fear of conflict, always end the same way. You give more. She respects you less. Rule number 2. If you can't explain the why, she won't respect the no. A flat no without context doesn't sound strong. It sounds defensive. And in a relationship, defensiveness is one of the fastest ways to lose authority. Here's what most men misunderstand. Women don't push against boundaries because they hate limits. They push when a boundary feels arbitrary, emotionally empty, or disconnected from who you are. A no with no emotional grounding can feel cold, controlling, or reactive, even when that's not your intention. That's why some men say no repeatedly and still get ignored. But the moment a boundary is anchored in a clear emotional reason, the entire dynamic shifts. You're no longer issuing a restriction. You're revealing something real about yourself. This is where female psychology comes in. Women don't respond primarily to rules. They respond to meaning, to emotional coherence, to whether what you're saying aligns with how you show up. A no without a why sounds like resistance. A no with a why sounds like self-awareness. When you say, "This matters to me because," you're doing more than explaining. You're signaling 3 things at once. You understand yourself. You take responsibility for your emotional state. And you're stable enough to articulate it without hostility. That combination is difficult to dismiss. Notice the difference. "Don't go through my phone" invites tension. But privacy matters to me because it helps me feel trusted and grounded in this relationship, communicates something else entirely. Not secrecy, not control, identity. Women don't resist boundaries that feel authentic. They resist boundaries that feel performative or reactive. And here's the part most men miss. Explaining your why is not about convincing her. It's about holding your frame. You're not asking her to agree with your feelings. You're stating that they exist and that they matter. That's what creates respect. Men who can name their emotional reasons are harder to disrespect. Not because they're louder, but because they're internally aligned. Their words, tone, and presence point in the same direction. When your no is backed by clarity and emotional ownership, it doesn't invite negotiation. It invites understanding. And understanding is the foundation that respect quietly grows from. Rule number 3, never set boundaries while you're emotional. This is where a lot of men undo everything they've built, without realizing it. When you're frustrated, irritated, or hurt, your boundary doesn't come out as leadership. It comes out as complaint. What should be a clear line turns into a reaction. And reactions, no matter how justified they feel, instantly weaken your position. Here's why. When emotions are high, your nervous system takes over. Your tone sharpens. Your words speed up. Your body language tightens. Even if what you're saying makes sense, the state you're in communicates something else entirely. Women don't listen to the content first. They feel the state behind it. So when you try to set a boundary in the middle of emotional charge, it doesn't land as calm authority. It lands as pressure, as volatility, as someone trying to regain control after already losing it. That's what emotional leakage does. It leaks power. Compare two men. One snaps the moment a boundary is crossed. His voice carries frustration. His words feel urgent. He's reacting to the moment. The other notices the same violation, but he doesn't rush. He holds it. He waits. And when he speaks, it's measured, deliberate, and grounded. Same boundary, completely different impact. The second man doesn't need to convince. He doesn't need to escalate. His timing does the work for him. This is why elite emotional control isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about choosing when they enter the room. When you speak from calm, your boundary feels like a decision, not a demand. Like structure, not punishment. The formula is simple, but most men ignore it. Observe what happened. Pause long enough to regain neutrality. Then speak when your nervous system is no longer driving the conversation. When you do that, something shifts. Your words slow down. Your presence steadies. And suddenly, your boundary feels less like resistance and more like direction. Calm timing turns boundaries into leadership. And leadership is what women instinctively respond to, not because it's loud, but because it's stable. Rule number 4. Stop compromising. Start structuring agreements. This rule is where most men get trapped by advice that sounds mature, but quietly destroys attraction. You've been told that healthy relationships are about compromise. Meeting halfway. Giving a little so things stay fair. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Adult. Balanced. But here's what almost no one tells you. Compromise often means both people walk away slightly dissatisfied. And dissatisfaction, when repeated, doesn't disappear. It turns into resentment. Quiet resentment that erodes respect and attraction over time. Women are not drawn to men who constantly sacrifice themselves to keep things smooth. They may appreciate it at first. They may even benefit from it. But attraction doesn't grow from unspoken concessions. It fades. This is why so many men feel drained in relationships they worked hard to keep fair. The alternative is not dominance, and it's not stubbornness, it's structure. An agreement is fundamentally different from a compromise. A compromise asks, how much are you willing to give up? An agreement asks, how do we build something that actually works for both of us? Structure creates clarity. Clarity creates stability. And stability is deeply attractive. Think about common tension points. Social life versus downtime. Personal freedom versus shared routines. Work priorities versus relationship expectations. When these are handled through compromise, one person usually bends more than the other, again and again. But when they're handled through agreements, something changes. Agreements have boundaries. They have rhythm. They have predictability. Both people know what to expect, and neither feels like they're constantly paying an emotional tax to keep the peace. That's the part men miss. Attraction dies when one person keeps paying emotional taxes. Women don't feel safer or more connected when you quietly give up pieces of your life. They feel safer when the relationship has order, when decisions are intentional, when expectations are clear. This isn't about asking, who gives in this time? It's about asking, what structure allows both of us to stay grounded long term? When you move from compromise to agreement, you stop bargaining for approval. You start designing a dynamic. And designing requires confidence. It requires knowing your limits. It requires respecting your own needs enough to protect them without guilt. That's why agreements don't feel heavy. They feel relieving. They remove guesswork. They reduce friction. They prevent resentment before it has a chance to form. And when a woman senses that you're no longer negotiating your happiness away, but instead organizing your life with intention, she doesn't push harder. She adjusts. Rule number 5. Boundaries that aren't reinforced will be tested. If you've ever wondered why the same issues keep coming back, why a boundary you already set somehow gets crossed again, this is why. A boundary that isn't reinforced doesn't exist. It's just a suggestion with a memory. Here's the part men often misinterpret. When a woman tests a boundary, it's not automatically malicious. It's not always manipulation. More often, it's instinct. A natural check for consistency. She's sensing whether what you said last time still holds, or whether it was just situational. And the moment you bend without acknowledgement, you teach her a new rule. One exception becomes a pattern. One pass becomes precedent. This is where many men quietly lose credibility. They believe that letting something slide just this once makes them reasonable. But from a psychological standpoint, inconsistency creates uncertainty. And uncertainty does not generate respect. Consistency does. Consistency. Reinforcement doesn't mean arguments. It doesn't mean repeating yourself louder. It doesn't mean turning every interaction into a confrontation. Reinforcement is recalibration. A calm return to the standard you already set. When you revisit a boundary, you're not reopening a debate. You're maintaining alignment. That distinction matters. A man who avoids revisiting boundaries because he fears tension ends up living in quiet resentment. A man who revisits calmly communicates something very different. This matters to me, and I take myself seriously enough to protect it. That message lands. Consistency creates safety. Inconsistency creates contempt. Think about it from her side. When rules shift based on mood, timing, or pressure, the relationship feels unstable. But when boundaries remain steady, even when circumstances change, there's a sense of reliability, predictability, ground. And that's when the testing slows down. Not because she's been controlled, but because there's nothing left to test. You don't need to police behavior. You need to hold your position, quietly, repeatedly, without emotional charge. That's how boundaries move from words into reality, and that's when respect stops being conditional. Something subtle happens when you start holding your boundaries correctly. There's no announcement, no dramatic conversation, no sudden transformation overnight, but you feel it. She starts checking in with you instead of pushing past you. She asks instead of assuming. She pauses before crossing lines she used to step over without thinking. Not because you became controlling, not because you raised your voice, but because you became harder to move. When your boundaries are clear, emotionally grounded, well-timed, structured, and consistently reinforced, the dynamic recalibrates on its own. The chaos fades, the friction lowers, the constant testing loses its purpose. You'll notice fewer power struggles, not because you won, but because there's nothing to fight against anymore. You're no longer reactive. You're no longer negotiating your worth in real time. And that changes how she relates to you. Your decisions start carrying more weight. Your time feels more respected. Even disagreements feel different. Cleaner, shorter, less charged. There's less drama, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because you're no longer creating it through inconsistency. The biggest shift, though, happens inside you. You feel lighter, calmer, more centered. You stop overthinking every interaction. You don't rehearse conversations in your head. You don't feel the need to explain yourself into exhaustion. You know where you stand. And when a man knows his position, others feel it, even if they can't articulate why. That's the quiet power most men are missing. Not dominance, not toughness, stability. When you stop bending out of fear and start standing out of self-respect, people adjust, especially the woman you're with, not because you demanded respect, but because you finally embodied it. At this point, you should see the pattern clearly. These 5 rules were never about controlling a woman, managing her reactions, or winning arguments. They were about something far more fundamental: reclaiming your position, clarity, emotional reasoning, timing, structured agreements, reinforcement. Together they form a system, not a trick, not a script. A system that determines whether you move through a relationship with quiet authority, or slowly give pieces of yourself away until respect evaporates. Here's the shift most men need to internalize. Boundaries are not there to make you more lovable. They're not there to keep someone from leaving. Boundaries exist so you can live with yourself. The moment you stop explaining yourself from weakness, everything changes. Your words slow down. Your presence settles. You no longer need to convince, defend, or justify. You simply show up as someone who knows where he stands. And when that happens, the world responds differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because you made it non-negotiable through your behavior. If this resonated, do not scroll past it. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Share it with a man who's been losing ground without realizing it. And leave a comment below. Tell me which rule hit you the hardest, or where you finally saw how much you've been giving away. Because awareness is the first line of defense. And once you see the pattern, you don't unsee it. From that point on, how you're treated is no longer an accident.